And what we're going to talk about is an educational philosophy that's based on Native American child raising practices. And, that kind of sounds a little bit foreign to people. Like, why would we be thinking about Native American child raising practices in this context? And what I found fascinating about the whole idea of the circle of courage is that it is so relevant to how we should think about supporting and helping children and adolescents today in our world right now. And not only do I think that it's relevant, but all of the, well, not, I wouldn't say all, let's say the majority of uh, theorists and professionals that work with children and adolescents today now see how relevant a lot of their philosophies were to helping children in need today. For a long time, the way we sort of looked at Native American child raising practices was that, well, it seems to make sense, but none of it was really scientifically based. It wasn't empirically based. There's no research behind it. So what we did then was to do our own research. In the United States and other European countries, they did their own research on what are effective practices in helping children and adolescents. And what they arrived at after years of research, and research through many of our top institutions like Harvard University and the University of Chicago and places like that, they arrived at the same thing that the Native American practices were stating for hundreds and hundreds of years. So I always found that to be fascinating. So what I wanted to do was to talk about what were those practices like, how do they work, and how can we use them, and how are they relevant for us and how we're using them. So a lot of the practices are talked about in this book that I put up for you, Reclaiming Youth at Risk, Our Hope for the Future. And this was one of the best-selling books that the National Education Association ever had. And you can get this book if you're interested. And one of the things I like about this book, it's only 200 and some pages. So it doesn't take you months to get through this book, but it's loaded with relevant information. And it also really borrows from other like-minded professionals who also see the benefit of using these practices. And it's kind of detailed in terms of how they have tailored their interventions to help people. So some of the people could include like Maria Montessori, who founded Montessori schools, Abraham Maslow, a famous developmental psychologist, and there's a lot more. So if you're interested, you can get this book for not much money. And like I said, it's loaded with very, very relevant information. So the circle of courage. This circle in front of you now, this very colorful circle, represents a lot of things in the Native American cultures. And I don't know if many of you have spent much time out west, like in New Mexico and Arizona and places like that. But I had the privilege to be able to do that for a while. And you'll see this circle in a lot of different places because, like I said, it's very relevant to the culture. But some of the things that the circle represents in Native American culture is that it's the interconnectedness of all things in the world, so how one thing depends on another thing for survival. And when one section of something happens to one person, it happens to another person and to other people. So there's kind of a ripple effect. And the other thing it represents is that those four sectors represent different races of the world, and north, south, east, and west. And so, and how there's no end to how things are put together. So, and it represents other things as well, but that's just kind of the short version of some of the things that it represents in their culture. So they use this circle of courage, this circle, or this wheel, if you will, to explain what are the things that are needed by children and adolescents today to help them be fully functioning individuals, to grow up and be happy, healthy adults. But not only as adults, but to be happy and healthy as children and adolescents as well. And so we'll go over those things and we'll explain what they mean. And I'm also going to explain, what the lack thereof having one of these things means in a child or an adolescent's life, and what we can do about it. And the other thing I wanted to kind of weave into this presentation today, because it has to do with another like-minded individual who agrees with this philosophical approach. And that is Alfred Adler, a famous psychologist. And what I wanted to talk about then when we come up to that portion is why children choose to misbehave. So what is the payoff for misbehavior? And it comes down to 4 categories. And I find that really fascinating too. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that. So another like-minded individual, Daniel Goleman, you may or may not have heard of him, but his study and his research was done on what they call emotional intelligence, or the feeling-learning connection. So very much our feelings determine our capacity to learn. And so he sees like feeling being a part of how we focus, being a part of our memory or what we retain, and then ultimately being part of what we learn and how we learn in the world. So students have difficulty remembering or internalizing our curriculum or what we're teaching them if they are too emotional. Some emotion is good, but being too emotional has the opposite effect, that children then can basically only concentrate on emotion and not the academic or cognitive part of their existence. So without access to our memory, we can't learn. So emotional intelligence, it really accounts for 70% of our well-being, like how we feel about ourselves in the world. And some things that an emotionally intelligent person is, they're aware of their own emotions and they're able to manage them. So it's not the denial of emotions and it's not experiencing emotions, but it's being able to manage them when it's time to manage them. And it's being aware of others' emotions and managing how we react to them, and then how a person loves, works, and plays well. So all of those things kind of work into it. Now, they're continuing to do research on emotional intelligence, and they're learning more and more about how that works with children and adolescents in their lives. But what we hear most about is IQ, or their intelligence quotient. So people will, there's IQ scores, and there's so many scores based on an IQ, and you can be in a gifted program if you have 130 IQ, and there's other curriculum markers that say that you're worthy to be in a gifted program. But what we found out is that actually your intelligence quotient, your IQ, is really only about 40% responsible for how successful you can be in the world. And 60% is emotional intelligence. But we don't really focus on that, in schools, but we're starting to a little bit more. I mean, there is a lot more curriculum that's now focused on how children interact and being, respectful in terms of being social beings, taking a look at different things like anti-bullying concepts, peer mediation concepts, being a good citizen, restorative justice. So all of those terms now, they're starting to pay some attention to, but it's amazing that we haven't paid more attention to them, given how important it is in the success of our young people and in the world. So again, there is a little blurb about the Circle of Courage and then the book for Reclaiming Youth at Risk, Brent Troe, Broken Leg, and Ben Bachern. And if you want to look that up on Amazon or somewhere else, you can be able to get that book. And anthropologists have long known that Native Americans raise courageous, respectful children. without using aversive control. So with not using punishment, basically, or the use of punishment, which I think is pretty interesting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. And again, I just want to say, if you did have questions or comments that you wanted to make, you can put that in the chat, and Peyton will bring those up at the end. But if you have something you want me to explain a little bit further, if you're not sure of one of the concepts that we're talking about, you can ask Peyton to kind of just chime in, and I can get that answered for you or clarified for you. Okay, and looking at what are the 4 areas that children and adolescents absolutely need in their lives to be fully functioning and to be happy and healthy in terms of their emotional life. Number 1, independence. So the Native American teachings were designed to build respect and to teach inner discipline. So children were encouraged to make decisions, solve problems, be problem solvers on their own. And a lot of, and I've seen this now, I teach at a university. That gets to be more and more of a challenge now that individuals are having some trouble with problem solving. So that's an issue for people going forward. It always has been an issue, but effective decision making, solving problems, taking personal responsibility, and adults modeled and nurtured and taught these values and gave constructive feedback along the way. You can think about when you were a kid, sometimes we were given feedback by our parents or by a teacher or some other adult in our lives. We didn't always like the feedback. Maybe it was something we sort of rejected at the time. But then when you think back on it, you think how valuable that was. And, it makes me think of, when my parents would give me feedback, I didn't always like it. But then I thought, there was wisdom in that. And so it's really about that whole idea of modeling. And we know now how valuable modeling is, how valuable mentoring is in the world. So, mentoring has been determined to be one of the most effective things that you can do to help a young person learn and grow. So looking for opportunities to do that, to have kids be mentored, by us, by adults in their lives, and other important adults around them. And then the next one is generosity, which was an important goal in the culture, Native American culture. And what it stressed was the importance of being generous and unselfish, right? Generous and unselfish. Sometimes when you look at what the modern day theorists talked about when they agreed with these concepts, they may have given them a little bit different terms. Like for generosity, they called it altruism, but they're saying that we need the same thing. For independence that I just talked about, they would describe that as autonomy. So those terms become interchangeable, but they're speaking to the same thing. And this whole idea of generosity too, like when you're helping other people, young people feel like if they can help somebody else, they create their own proof that they have worth in the world. And it becomes that important, but I think when you think about like maybe middle school age, like 12, 13, 14 years old, you don't think, wow, how generous are those individuals? Do you think about it? When you think about that age, sometimes you think about, kids being sort of self-centered at that age where they're trying to find themselves. They're trying to break away from adult control in a lot of ways. But at the same time, they're trying to figure out who are they in the world. And if they know that they have worth to help other people, it goes a long way in making them feel this sense of security and building their sense of their self-esteem. And so they know that they have power to make positive contribution to another human life and to life in general. And then the next concept is belonging. And so, I worked, as some of you noted, have listened to my presentation. I was a school counselor for almost 11 years, and I'm still a consultant to public schools. And so what I found out when during that period of time, I was a middle school and an elementary school counselor, but I found out that through this idea of belonging, the first thing I would look for when a child was maybe acting out in school or didn't want to go to school or was having some other behavioral issues in school was to look at that idea of belonging. Because if a child feels like they belong to that environment, they're not likely to act out. They're not as likely to rebel against it or to not want to be part of it. There has to already be that idea that they don't feel this sense of being tied to the environment somehow. So I would always look at ways then to help children regain that sense that they do belong. And I have more ideas on that, and there's some other slides coming up, and then I'll be able to expand on those a little bit in terms of how we can help our kids. But their idea was, and their philosophy was, be related somehow to everyone you know. So treating others as a family, that helped to forge really powerful social bonds of community that drew all into relationships of respect in some way. So I'm describing these. Think about how these things are working and or not working for us today in our culture. And then the last one was this idea of mastery. So the first lesson in traditional Native American culture was that one should always observe those with more experience to learn from them. It goes back to that idea of mentoring. So the child was taught to see someone with more skills than them as a model for learning and not as a rival. And in our culture now, we tend to, because we're such an individualistic, competitive culture, we are tending to see people who have more skills than us as a rival somehow, or somebody that we need to kind of compete against. Excuse me. So it's important that we have more of this sense of looking at what we can learn from other people who have more skills than us. And I'm going to expand upon that as well in the slides coming up. So the education philosophy is incorporating a Native American belief system as an approach to fostering a positive environment, to promote self-esteem, to help people be motivated, and help them be good citizens of the world. So I gave you a little bit of a overview of what some of those concepts are. We're going to get into them a little bit more right now. This might be a good place, though, for me to talk about this. And I don't have this on the slide. So if you want to jot down a note about this, you can. I mean, it's up to you. But what I'm going to talk about right now, because they're so related, are the 4 goals of misbehavior. So why do our kids act out? Why do adolescents act out? Why do they misbehave? And really, it comes down to 4 areas, right? And so the first one, the first overall thing that they talk about in terms of this is this idea of lack of belonging, which we talked about. We're going to talk about a little bit more. So when that's not there, that's kind of an overall kind of umbrella thing that guides the rest of the behaviors. So always think about that. How tied to an environment is a person? When kids tell you they don't want to go to school, they're not feeling this sense of belonging. They're sort of feeling this sense of like, I'm on the outside, right? It's almost like somebody took a circle and drew a circle and included the other kids in that classroom, but a couple kids didn't get it included in that circle. And so they're feeling, for whatever reason. And then the 4 goals of misbehavior are, number 1, um, to get attention, right? And so attention says, look at me. I'm here in the world. I need attention. And, kids will substitute negative attention. It's just as good as positive attention. It's the same thing. It's just attention. And so we have to think about that, right? When we're working with kids, if we keep chastising a kid for the same behavior, it's almost like we're reinforcing that behavior in a way, because that child sees that they're getting attention because they keep getting chastised for the same thing over and over again. But they're getting our attention. We're talking with them. We're putting energy into it, and so they see that as substitution for positive attention. So, one of the things that is important that we do for our children is to make sure we catch them doing something good. A lot of times we catch them doing something negative, but let's catch them when they're doing something good and really paying attention to that. Because one of the basic tenets of human behavior is that the behaviors that you pay attention to, you're going to get more of. So remember that the behaviors that we pay attention to, we're going to get more of. And that's pretty simple, but it is also powerful in that it will be a guiding force in behavior. So remember that when you're working with the kids to catch them doing something good. So that's attention is the number one, or that's number one. That's 1 out of 4 ways that they misbehave. The second one, and sometimes we don't often think about this one, but it's for revenge. So maybe a child feels slighted, feels left out. And if you think about this, children really have this heightened sense of fairness. And I'm sure you've kind of noticed that why is one sibling getting this and I'm not getting this? And, very possibly they're not seeing the whole picture, but in their world, they're tuned into this sense of what's fair and what isn't fair. So if they feel slighted in some way, they can misbehave out of revenge. And often they will do that. And we're not sure sometimes why they're acting out, because a lot of times kids won't have the verbal ability to kind of frame that, because feeling left out is sort of an abstract concept, or feeling slighted. So they might not always be able to say that, but sometimes they might say, well, so-and-so was given something and I wasn't. So-and-so was allowed to do something and I wasn't. And before we just flat out reject that and say, no, it wasn't that way because you got this or that, acknowledge it and try to understand it, provide empathy when we can, and that's going to then lessen the chance that a child will act out or misbehave out of revenge. So that was the second one. The third one is for power. So just like all human beings, we have this sense, we want to have this sense of having some power in the world, and sometimes they'll call it control. And so as adults, we want to have a fair amount of control, because if we feel like we have some control, we feel like we have some things figured out, then it lessens our anxiety, in the world. But when children feel powerless, sometimes, or they feel like they're not being respected for having rights, for having power, for having contributions that they can make, then it can be like, well, let's fight. So if they feel like a teacher isn't respecting them, or a parent isn't respecting them, they might just fight. So they're just going to show you oppositional behaviors, and they're not even going to listen to our counter arguments. They're just going to be right away ready for their own counter argument. And that's about having some power. If they feel like, look, I can, and maybe even they get the pleasure of seeing us lose control as an adult, then we get angry, and maybe we yell, and maybe we throw our hands up, and they're like, okay, look how powerful I am. How I can get an adult to do that. So they may not be thinking about it in those terms, but unconsciously it's getting reinforced because they see what's going on in front of them. They're seeing how their behavior is impacting adults around them and other people around them. So that gives them a sense of power. So you can reduce that by, making sure that you hear people out, making sure that they feel included and respected. One of the things that teachers often did in the classrooms was for a child who was acting out, share some of the power with them. Why don't you pass out all these assignments for the day? Why don't you collect the pencils? And it works. It works because they feel like, okay, I have some power. I'm included. And they had that need where maybe they'd been marginalized in other areas of their lives. So that was number 3, power. And the fourth way kids, or reason that kids misbehave, is for this avoidance of failure, or to not feel some sense of inadequacy. So, and that often happens in schools, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the slide on mastery. But kids will want to avoid failure. You'll see that in classrooms a lot of times, and you'll see it in families too. So a child doesn't want to be seen as being inadequate in accomplishing a task. Maybe it's doing their homework. And so what do? They start a fight, or they act out, or they divert your attention in some way. Because like being seen as a kid who acts out is superior to feeling inadequate in some way in terms of being able to accomplish a task. So think about that when there's misbehavior. Is a child trying to avoid something, and what are they trying to avoid? And if we can walk them through that, then we can maybe get at the heart of what some of these misbehaviors were. And I use these different goals of misbehavior with teachers a lot. When teachers would get overwhelmed by children misbehaving, and if you think about it, you could think of like 100 reasons why, or in your mind, you might be going through 100 reasons why your child is misbehaving, or one of your children's peers is misbehaving. But what's good about this is you think about it, and it actually fits under one of these 4 categories. Almost always. I've not seen a behavior not fit under one of these categories. And that then is really illuminating in terms of what can you do? What can you do to change this behavior around? So think about that. Attention, revenge, power, and avoidance of failure. So moving on, and a lot of those areas of misbehavior are going to be also included in our further discussion about the circle of courage. So in looking at this idea of the spirit of belonging, there's a famous psychologist, Abraham Maslow. A lot of you might have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But in his research and what he's found out is that an individual must have a sense of belonging before self-esteem and self-actualization, like being the best people we can be realized. So tell me that's not powerful, because we're all trying to be better than we were, because a lot of what the modern theory is saying is right now is that we're hardwired to achieve competency. So as human beings, we're hardwired to be better and to learn more and to be a better person. And I do believe that very soundly, and I see it. But I know that there are things along the way that thwart individuals in their attempt to achieve competency, to be better than we were yesterday. Things come along and they thwart us, or they block us, or we see a wall that we can't get around somehow. So, but this idea of belonging is that important. We can't go on to be better until we've established some sense of belonging. And I hopefully that doesn't sound intimidating to people, because this sense of belonging can be like a very small family, or an individual in a family, or it can be in a classroom, it could be in a club. There's a lot of different ways that we can achieve that. It doesn't have to be with 10 different places that you establish that. And some people are very gregarious, and maybe they have that. But that's not the important part. It just has to be establishing some sense of belonging. And within that sense of belonging, then an individual can work on relationships in terms of mutual trust and respect as being two fundamental things that go into a lot of, or go into every relationship, I guess I should say. But you see that a lot of times people don't have that. You'll see that with, domestic violence is a huge issue in our culture in general. It's a really big issue still on college campuses. And, maybe those individuals are still learning about what's important in terms of relationship, having mutual trust and respect, and how that actually gets translated into behavior. So the ultimate display of belonging is how a person behaves. So a student really belongs when they display behaviors that are respectful of other people and show that they like to belong, that it's important to them. And then below are some things that we would advise teachers of. And, it would be a little bit different for parents. So, we tell teachers to know students' name, to greet each student daily. Such a powerful thing. We want to, part of the efforts of school districts were to improve the attendance because there's a lot of students that habitually don't attend school. And so we were thinking about ways that we could improve attendance in the school that I worked at. And we came up with this idea, and it had to be by volunteers. So we couldn't make teachers do this, but we asked for volunteers, and we got, out of 45 students in the one elementary school, we got like half of the teachers that said, yeah, I'll volunteer to do this. And what we asked them to do was to mentor a couple students, but the mentoring consisted of meeting a student at the door of the school in the morning. And these were students who had issues with attendance. They had low attendance or sporadic attendance. And so the teacher, the adult teacher, would volunteer to meet them at the door before they even walked into the school. And they would just greet them, positively, and ask them how their morning was going and saying, it's great to see you at the school today. Just things like that. And the attendance increased exponentially just from a small act like that. Because, when a student got to school, here was somebody looking out for them that said, we're glad that you're here. Come on into the school. We hope that you have a great day today. So those things were just go a long, long way. And we've seen them play out and how important they can be. So, the idea of treating each of our kids respectfully, that can be challenging sometimes when we lose our temper or we're tired of saying the same things over and over again. The other piece about it is like celebrating differences, knowing that each child's going to be different. And, there's the adage that every child can learn. That's absolutely true, but not in the same way and not on the same day. So it's celebrating those differences that there are going to be different ways of approaching work, of approaching their peers and approaching adults. And it's recognizing and celebrating that there will be differences and not chastising them for doing things a little bit differently. So that's some ideas behind the idea of this spirit of belonging. So the next one is the idea of mastery. So that each child should be given the opportunity to demonstrate some competence in some area. So what you see a lot of times, and this is pretty common now, a lot of children, adolescents, young adults, maybe adults, I can just expand it, are struggling with mathematics, right? We just don't do well in that area. Well, that's one of the core areas in a school. So many students feel like they don't have this success in that area. And sometimes Well, we actually, well, I saw this a lot as a school counselor that, students would have tried to avoid those classes because they just didn't feel that sense of adequacy in that classroom. So maybe they'd act out and they would, you know, do anything they could not to be in that class. And there's a whole approach to kind of looking at that now in schools. It's called a functional behavioral assessment. And what a functional behavioral assessment does in the schools is to help look at, well, when a child acts out, what's going on at that time? Is it right before math class every day? Or is it right before English class? Is it right before physical education? Is it right before lunch? Is it right after lunch? So looking at those different areas and trying to draw some parallels in terms of how do we help a child do better, and what are they trying to avoid, and what are their frustrations around that are leading to inappropriate behaviors. So it's important to think about, like, the behaviors don't exist in a vacuum, right? That they're being influenced by other things. And if we can find out what those influences are, we can make some changes that help children do better. But the idea of mastery is saying that a student has to do well in at least one area. Like, so they have to, one of the, so if, do they have one subject that they feel that they really excel in? Or maybe there's a sport that they feel that they do really well in. And all of those things are important because that's going to be what connects them to this idea of mastery. And, they're starting to look at this differently now, but when I was in schools, I used to argue for this. If a student's grades got too low, they wouldn't let them participate in sports. And I always thought, well, a student had some mastery at sports, but now they're going to take their one area of mastery away. And I know what they were trying to achieve, but a lot of times it didn't work. They end up taking that one area of mastery away, and the student ended up doing worse. So it's really about thinking about what you think about your own children. What's an area that they're good at? Because they need that through. If a child has one area that they feel that they have a pretty high degree of mastery in, then they can translate that to other areas in their lives. Eventually, it's not going to happen overnight, but that they know that they have that. So it's important to focus on the particular talents of that child, that they're able to share that talent, if at all possible. And I'm sure you hear this a lot, being strength-based. So rather than saying to children, well, you're not good here, you didn't do well here, saying, you're really good in this area. You show a lot of potential in this area. I like how you drew that picture. I liked how you sang that song. I liked how you told that joke. It's recognizing those types of things that become so important, that we used to see as kind of being extraneous, but that's actually as important as sitting there and doing well on that test. So when success is met, the desire to achieve is strengthened. So if a child can see this idea of success, they can build on that. But if all they see is a lot of failure, they don't have a whole lot to build on there. And the other thing, and I've said this a lot in schools, we ask children to be good in 7 subjects, and to be good, to pass, or to get a passing grade in all 7 subjects. So basically, to achieve competency in 7 subjects. And the thing is, as adults, how many of us are good in 7 subjects? If you think about it, probably not that many of us. I mean, we pick certain areas that we're good at, and maybe we work in those. We work in those areas, or those are the areas that we pay more attention to in our lives and devote a lot of our energy to. But then we ask kids, like I said, we ask kids to be competent in 7 areas, and a lot of times they're not ready to do that. And I've seen, it can turn around. I've seen kids not be good at a subject in elementary school, and then they get in high school and it's their favorite subject. But it's about being accepting of the fact that they may learn in a different way, and making sure, above all, making sure that we recognize what they do have strengths in. Okay, the next one is this idea of the spirit of independence. So a lot of the models that we kind of rely on now for discipline are what we call obedience models. And so obedience is like you obey, and if you don't obey, you are going to be punished. And that, that's very prevalent in schools. And again, it's they do suspensions in schools, which again now they're looking at. I used to actually the principals that I worked with in the school that I was at, they were really open to let's develop ways that instead of punishing a child by sending them home for 3 days or 5 days, we can find a way that they can give back to the environment. And so we did that. And there were some legal things we had to look through, there were all types of things. But we would have children like maybe do cafeteria duty to help out in the cafeteria instead of going home for a suspension. And we did a lot more in-school suspensions where they might be asked to help other students or to help out with the school in some way. And that was far superior to sending people home. Because when you send people home on a suspension, basically what you're saying is that you're not good enough to be part of our community. You're not part of our community. So that ties into their feeling this sense of independence and not belonging. So it ties into so many different areas. So this idea, though, is there's a lot of learned dependency in our culture, and I think there's different theories about why it happens. But I think each generation wanted to do more for our kids, and sort of starts to reach a point of diminishing returns. Like, are we doing too much for kids? Doing too much in terms of things that they could do on their own and would benefit from doing on their own. So the whole idea of independence in the Native American culture was that the whole idea of learning and becoming better became the responsibility of the individual, right? And that each individual was in control of their learning process. We've in schools we've somewhat taken that process away, but I know now with children having access to so much information, as long as it's directed in the right way, it can be a benefit, at home through exploration and research and things that kids can do. So, but this idea of autonomy is a powerful motivator, that they need to be independent. Like, what are the things we would do? This is just like an example from, childhood. If we saw a 2-year-old trying to open a door, and they were really struggling with that handle, they sort of had their hand on it, but they couldn't get it. We would, in our culture, we would rush over and open that for them, right? And the Native American cultures would say, we're going to let that kid just struggle with that for a while. So maybe the kid struggles with that, trying to open that door for 30 minutes or 40 minutes. And then they finally open that door and they're like, wow, they have this sense of being independent, that they were able to do it on their own. So that's a small example, but that small example translates into other examples. What are some things that we can let kids do on their own that we don't have to rush in and do for them? Because that whole idea of independence or autonomy becomes really important. It's really important in young adolescents, like 12, 13, 14-year-olds, because developmentally, what they're trying to do is to develop their own sense of autonomy away from their parents. And it's tough for them because at the same time, they know they still need their parents, they still need adult guidance. And then their idea is that they have to be their own person too. So there's a lot going on there at that age. So if we can help facilitate that idea and model it for them is what they're saying. So we can model a framework for each person to kind of take advantage of their particular learning style and what they're interested in. And there's some things that people can do in classrooms in schools. They can be given jobs. They can encourage students to make positive choices, and you can do that at home with our kids too. Provide opportunities for leadership becomes really important. This idea of self-responsibility and learning, problem solving. So all of providing those opportunities for kids to be involved in those before we jump in. And then when they get some things right, providing a whole lot of encouragement for that whole idea. And then the next one is kind of this spirit of generosity. And there's the idea that um, one of the highest virtues is unselfishness or giving back. And so this whole idea of self-esteem and our self-worth, sort of like I mentioned earlier on the other slide, it's really increased by our learning to help other people. And when I say learning to help, sometimes it's not intuitive. In fact, a lot of times it's not intuitive. We have to learn how we can help other people. And then we have to learn what is our ability to help others. And when we can learn that, it's hugely important in our lives, because it helps to nurture that virtue that we're important, that we have worthiness in the world. That is, I do group counseling from time to time, and I run groups. But one of the ideas in the group, why groups are so important for people and help people work through different problems and things like that, is because they find out that they can be of benefit to other people in the group. And when they find out they can be of benefit to others, it increases their ability to take control over problems in their own lives. So it's about thinking about that. I know when I was a school counselor, I developed some opportunities for kids to be involved in projects where they were able to give back to the community. And this was way back, after the events of September 11th. And for those of you who are old enough to remember that time, there was so much unknown about what was going to happen at that time. And there was a lot of insecurity. And what happens was, when I was in the elementary school, the third and fourth grade students said, is there anything we can do to help? And I remember we suggested that they write cards and letters to the NYPD up in New York, because those were their heroes, and we saw them taking charge and helping so many people. And they wrote all these beautiful letters, and they did illustrations on the letters, and they did drawings. And I remember that they were the police precincts that posted all of these drawings outside of their police office walls. And then we got a call at the elementary school from 5 NYPD who drove all the way down from New York City to our elementary school here in Pittsburgh. And they wanted to personally thank the children for that boost that they gave them. And I'll never forget that, because their heroes, they were dressed in their dress blues, came, and we had an assembly at the school, and they got on a microphone. They wanted to thank all the kids for their contribution. And after that day, the children they were like, Dr. Lepore, what can we do next? And they always wanted to do some other type of project. And I know we did a food and animal toy drive for the Animal Friends. And Animal Friends said it was the largest single donation they ever had, because they collected so many things. But once that kind of spirit gets into people, that they see they have the ability to impact other people, they want to keep it going. They want to keep it going. So think about providing opportunities of service for individuals. That whole idea of random acts of kindness, which are so powerful. Peer mentoring is huge. We also did peer mentoring, and we peer mediation in the schools, and those kids loved being peer mentors. They trained for it, and these aren't all like, you don't always just pick the children who are the most well behaved. You want to pick children across the spectrum, maybe some that act out, or some that do well academically, some that do poor. academically, some that have really well behaved, others that aren't. So we trained all of them to be peer mediators, and it changed their behavior because they couldn't wait to be part of a mediation. And they also got to wear these red jackets that said peer mediator on them, and they put this jacket on, they were transformed, you know. So providing those opportunities and thinking about how we can provide them becomes so important for our kids' development. So here's just some overall things to kind of tie this all together. A happy and well-adjusted student has a healthy balance in the 4 values of the circle of courage. So when a child's happy and well-adjusted, you know that they're doing well in those areas. An unhappy student has an imbalance in one or more of the 4 values. And it could be observed as inappropriate behavior, right? We went over those ideas of misbehavior. So the teacher, student, and the parent can foster circle of courage within the parameters of the classroom and schools and at home. Helping a student to identify and balance his or her values is attainable with positive support from teachers, students, staff, and parents. So this just real quick, we'll go over like if there's an imbalance in the spirit of belonging. Students can feel, I sort of went over a lot of these in my examples, but they could be rejected. If they're rejected, they find distorted senses of belonging. And, you know, a distorted sense of belonging may be running with a group that, you know, isn't really engaged in pro-social behavior. Or if they're rejected, they can be reluctant to form human attachment. So, the anecdote is that unmet needs can be addressed by corrective relationships based on trust and caring. Okay, so if there's an imbalance in independence, that they fight against powerlessness by becoming rebellious or becoming aggressive, and you know, so if I feel kind of powerlessness in terms of not being able to be my own person or being overly controlled by others, maybe I can be really good at fighting, and nobody, you know, so that's their first go-to if they feel slighted or they feel frustrated or they feel hurt or they feel left out. They act with aggression. So the solution, provide opportunities to develop confidence, self-discipline, and given the opportunity to display leadership skills. You know, when a person acts out they're powerless and they act out trying to get power, that can be channeled into positive leadership. So that negative display of power can be easily channeled into positive leadership. Always think about that. If there's an imbalance in mastery, children may seek to prove their competency in distorted ways. So they may just like say, well, and I think most humans are guilty of this in some way. I shouldn't say guilty, but they use this way. What they do is, if I'm not good at something, I'm going to avoid it. So have you ever felt that way? I'm just not going to do things I'm not good at. And so a lot of people kind of feel that way. So they'll retreat from challenges, or maybe they'll become overachievers. So sometimes we don't think about that in our culture. We just think overachieving is good. But when somebody's constantly overachieving, they're going to be out of balance in other areas of their lives. So that can be channeled. Overachieving can be channeled into something that has more balance. Or they may cheat to gain what they want, you know. So the remedy is in a non-competitive environment, provide opportunities for meaningful achievement, and to model that for individuals. I'm going through these pretty quickly because we're using up most of our hour already. That seemed to go pretty fast. If there's an imbalance in generosity, without opportunities to give to others, people can become not really altruistic. They're locked in, or what happens is sometimes they can be taken advantage of, right? That other people can use them. And so they have to understand how their power translates into helping others, and that they won't be used at the hands of other people. So if they can experience joy in helping others and not being placed in servitude, that would be the response to that. So these are just a couple, I don't know how well you can see those, but I think you have access to this slide. But it's always fun to hear what kids have to say about these ideas in the classroom. So they wrote down some of their comments. This is a third grade classroom. They wrote their comments about how they, having learned these concepts in the school, how they see them being played out. And so it's interesting to see that. And this is just a fourth grade. Let's see, the fourth grade has a little better handwriting, but you can spend some time looking over those and seeing what some of the comments were. So I'm gonna end with this slide here. So in order for kids to change, sometimes change can come about as a moment of crisis and or chaos. We went through that this year, I think, with their school years being interrupted, and that's actually an opportunity. Maybe this period of chaos could be an opportunity for people to change. The idea of change is a journey, not a destination. So it's really about not getting to a certain place, but what we learn along the way. Needing to know yourself is important. I think we all have to kind of get to know ourselves a little bit better. And it's okay to feel uncomfortable. You're not wrong if you feel uncomfortable with change and being exposed to something different, because that really goes along with the journey. When faced with change, we might feel defensive. We might fight against it, because actually we have all these human defense mechanisms that keep us from wanting to change. So we are going to feel defensive in the face of change sometimes. So we're going to have to channel the power of language to help and not to harm. I think that's important, because when we do feel kind of maybe backed in a corner or uncomfortable, sometimes we can use the power of language to hurt sometimes. So always think about it as the power to help and not harm. So it requires us to honor where the individual is now. That becomes really important. We can be a celebration of a new beginning. An individual needs supports to overcome obstacles. We know each one of us can't do it alone. We need supports. And it requires leaders to encourage continued growth. That becomes an important part of how we promote wellness with